Yesterday we woke up to the shocking news that the Albanese government has abandoned its support of Israel. Overnight, it seems, Australia had changed its position by voting in favour of a UN General Assembly resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. That's, of course, never going to happen. The notion of a humanitarian ceasefire, while the terrorist organisation that runs Gaza is still holding innocent civilians hostage in a flagrant breach of the international rule of war, is absurd. To sign up to such a resolution, one that doesn't demand that Hamas be disarmed or doesn't demand it abandons its practice of turning civilians and hostages into human shields, makes the idea of a sustainable ceasefire a joke. Australia's support for the resolution puts us at odds with our AUKUS allies, the United States and Britain, and it puts us on the same side of the argument as Russia, China, North Korea and Iran. Australia should have joined our many allies amongst the 10 countries which took a principled stand against this resolution, or at least be amongst the 23 which abstained. The best way to end the suffering in Gaza is to bring the war to a sustainable conclusion as rapidly as possible, and that means Hamas must be disarmed. It won't be achieved by allowing armchair pundits like Foreign Affairs Minister Penny Wong to pontificate about how Israel should be fighting a difficult but necessary war. A ceasefire which leaves Hamas in control of Gaza will allow it to rebuild its military capabilities with the help of its friends in Iran. And Hamas, don't forget, has repeatedly expressed its determination to repeat the unprovoked massacre of October 7, quote, again and again. Under those circumstances, Israel has no alternative but to wage war until Hamas is utterly defeated. As Greg Sheridan wrote in The Australian today, the Albanese government doesn't even have the courage of its own lack of convictions. It's speaking out on both sides of its mouth to say contradictory things in the hope that contradictory audiences can be simultaneously appeased. The Albanese government's position reeks of tawdry electoral politics. Everything now is reactive, low-grade electoral politics. From day one of the crisis, the Albanese government has been ragged without the moral clarity Joe Biden has brought to the issue. Israel needs friends it can count on right now. Shamefully, Australia, under this government, is not among them. It's just 60 days since the terrible atrocities of October 7 in Israel, the worst massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and a moment that changed the world. It's too early to come to firm conclusions, but the world certainly feels a very different place after the unprecedented brutality of those attacks and the bizarre reactions in the Western world where the intelligentsia finds itself using the talking points of terrorists. More than ever, we need objectivity and clear-mindedness to assess where we're at and how best to save Western civilization from the barbarians without as well as within. That's why I was delighted to catch up with Danielle Pletka this week, an Australian who's become a leading foreign affairs commentator in the United States and in particular on the subject of the Middle East. Danielle is a former editorial assistant with the Los Angeles Times and Reuters who worked in Jerusalem from 1984 to 1985. She now works at the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative Washington, D.C. think tank, where she's vice president for foreign affairs and defence. I caught up with Danielle in Sydney, where she was visiting as a guest of the Australian-Israel Jewish Affairs Council. Danielle, can I ask you to comment first on what I think a lot of us thought was the extraordinary stance that the Albanese government has taken towards Israel, calling for a ceasefire, as if they knew how to conduct a war better than the people on the ground?
Well, that's something they have in common with a lot of other governments. Nobody ever hesitates to tell the Israeli government what to do. So I think the word you used is correct. I think it is extraordinary. First of all, it's not what we were promised. by the Albanese government, whether it's where the embassy is, whether it's a decision to refer to the Palestinian territories again in sort of 1960s terms as the occupied Palestinian territories. It's as if a group of graduates from 1972 uni all got power in Canberra and decided that everything they ever thought in uni should be the foreign policy of Australia. It's really terribly disappointing, and it's wrong. It's bad for Australia. It's bad for its relationship with its most important ally, the United States. And it's bad for the Australian people because it represents the kind of values that I think the country doesn't share.
It doesn't even represent a coherent foreign policy to me. It's more just a string of cliches, isn't it? That's
very well said. You cannot say Hamas must be destroyed, which is, of course, the Israeli aim, and yet there must be a ceasefire now. Either there's a ceasefire now and Hamas is not destroyed, or Hamas is destroyed. But they don't care. It's exactly what you said. It's a bunch of sentences that belong on placards at a foul Sydney demonstration against Israel, masquerading as a coherent foreign policy.
In the United States, there's no clearer indication of really, when the chips are down, where the Biden administration stands on this, are there?
I hope you're right. I'm a little bit nervous. I think we're coming to a crunch point. The problem is that, to my mind, the foreign policy of the Biden administration is actually the foreign policy of Joe Biden. Now, that's the way it should be. He's the boss, he's the chief executive, but of course that's not always the way it is. And so the most important thing here is to understand that Joe Biden's administration is full of people who are Obama administration people. He was obviously Obama's vice president. And these are not people who are friendly towards the state of Israel. These are people who are more friendly towards the state of Iran, honestly. So when you look at the foreign policy that has existed since October the 7th, what you really see is the voice and the clarity of an old school American Big D Democrat, right? When the Democratic Party was the party that supported Israel. The problem is that's not where the Democratic Party base is anymore. And as we creep closer and closer to the election, and as Biden loses more and more numbers in the polls, which he has because of this, because of his base, which is anti-Israel, then you see that pressure building on him. So you actually saw a break where he started to actually publicly say, Israel needs to slow down, fewer deaths, maybe cool it, maybe finish up soon.
Well, these kind of statements from the Canadians, well, you expect it from them.
Justin Trudeau.
The New Zealanders even, I guess they're new, they've got their feet under the table and they haven't quite got their head around things. But anyway, do these kind of statements, Israel needs to declare a ceasefire, it needs to act proportionally, all this kind of language. In the end, is that going to influence Israel at all, or does it just make it feel even more that it's on its own and it will just do things the way it has to?
What comes out of Canberra and New Zealand and Canada isn't going to influence the Israelis. That's just the chorus of haters, that you see at the UN and from various lefty governments in South America or in Africa. And I don't think that at all is taken with any weight in Jerusalem. But I do think that if the United States begins to shift even slightly, that has to impact the Israelis, simply because the United States is the bulwark. It is the most important ally for the Israelis. It's also the source of a lot of ammunition resupply, weaponry resupply, and so that, again, I think is going to be, a monkey on their back, telling them that, hurry up, do this, do it faster, but kill fewer people, but do it faster, get it done. And then we can move on to phase 2, whatever the heck that is.
Two things stick with me about October 7th. One is the barbarism, the extent of the barbarism in an inhuman manner, about 10 degrees anything more than I imagined a human being could do to another human being. But alongside that, you've got this extraordinary reaction from, if I can call them the intelligentsia in most of the world, often feminists involved, the supporters of LGBT rights, etc., all getting on the side of Hamas.
Queers for Palestine. Oh my God! Is there anything that encapsulates the stupidity of this? You know, a place where if you're gay, you are not simply harassed or discriminated against. You're murdered. And yes.
How do we explain it?
Well, there's one word.
Intelligent people seem to be.
No, there's one word, and I would not have used it before October 7th, but I have stripped away any of my inhibitions about this. This is anti-Semitism, okay? This is excusing the wanton murder of Jews, the brutal, as you say, beyond things we think are possible. And, you know, Israel likes to say Hamas is ISIS. This is worse than many of the things that ISIS did, right? The stories that we've heard, the things that people saw are unspeakable. And if you cannot bring yourself to condemn this, for whatever your ideological reasons are, then it's because you're an anti-Semite. And I know that sounds like a reductio ad absurdum, you know, it's just too simplistic. But that's the answer. Why is it that it's okay to do that to an Israeli, to a Jew? There's no other answer than because you believe that the Jews deserve it.
Once again, it's all reduced to cliches. It's not. You suspect that many of those people out there, those rallies, particularly the school kids that are out there protesting, wouldn't have a clue about where the Euphrates River was, or where the River Jordan lies, or
what Palestine is.
What Palestine is.
Absolutely not. But this is indoctrination. That's what it is. And, you know, some of the most intelligent... with a colleague, I have a podcast, and we've been very heavily focused on this because we talk a lot about foreign policy in America. And we've really sort of dug into the ideology behind this. One of the things that people fail to understand is that while, you know, Marxism failed in the Soviet Union, Marxism failed in other places, this really is a sort of Marxist-style campus ideology. It's not liberalism, you know, small L. It's not leftism, big L. This is the kind of authoritarian, totalitarian idea that rests within Marxist ideology. And I'm not some sort of right-wing lunatic. Well, maybe I am some sort of right-wing lunatic. But this is where this comes from. And the facts don't matter. And you must sign up to the whole panoply of ideas, right? It's not just that you need to sign up to, I believe there should be a state of Palestine. You have to sign up to the idea that Israelis are colonizers, that Jews are the oppressor class, that they are the white supremacists, that opposing this is being against racism. It's this mishmash of ideas, and you've got to sign up for the whole thing, right? And this is the problem. And so we've got little kids standing there, you know, with kafirs wrapped around their head, representing themselves as terrorists when they're babies. They have no idea.
The memory is so short, isn't it? The attention span is so short. You know, you despair about what they're learning about, say, the Holocaust, that defining moment in the 20th century. Do they even know about it?
Well, you saw, I don't know, maybe your listeners and viewers saw that last week a poll came out, and that 1 in 5, so 20% of American young people, believe that the stories of the Holocaust either didn't happen or are very much exaggerated. Now, all I can say about that is that's not shame on them. That's shame on us. Sorry. You know, the education system, upbringing, parents, the culture. You know what the most important meme on TikTok is, but you don't know that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust and how. Sorry, that should be a cause of horrified introspection in every one of our countries, but it isn't.
Boris Johnson spoke in Sydney last night. He gave the 11th John Howard lecture and gave a rousing defence of the free world and the need to stand up against tyranny. And I thought he linked very well the causes with which we should be linked now. One, defending Ukraine against Putin's aggression, because, as he put it, that's the most cost-effective way of putting tyrants in their place. But secondly, he linked it to Hamas and said that, you know, Putin would be rejoicing at the distraction and Iran is arming both Russia and Hamas. You can see this link there, that this is a battle that is far more important than what happens to that little relatively small strip of land on the southern border of Israel and Egypt.
Well, and let's bring it back home to Australia as well. It's not simply Russia, it's not simply Iran, it's also China, right? The Chinese have, since October 7th, flipped in ways that I think have surprised even very acute China watchers. They have sided 100% with Hamas, 100% with Iran. They have, on their domestic sites, they have erased Israel from the map. They have promoted on Douyin, their own domestic TikTok, anti-Semitism that is so virulent in its nature, it's the kind of thing we haven't seen in 50 years. This is what the Chinese are up to. Now again, people here may say to themselves, I don't care what the Chinese think about Israel or Hamas, but at the end of the day, what you see is, and I'm going to say it, you see this axis of evil, right? And the only thing that we need to remember is nothing stays in Ukraine, nothing stays in Gaza. It doesn't stay there. If you don't oppose it, and I'm sure, Boris Johnson alludes to this, right? If you don't stop it there, when it's cheaper and easier, and we don't have soldiers on the ground, it will come and find you.
That's the point, isn't it? Who are you standing in the grandstand alongside cheering this side on? And if you find that it's Putin and Iran and President Xi, something's got to tell you you're on the wrong side of the argument.
Isn't that obvious? I mean, shouldn't it be obvious? You'd think.
You would. To Israel itself, what's your reading from the people you've been talking to, what you've been studying about the mood within Israel?
Look, I've talked to a lot of Israelis, obviously, and this is... I talk about anything, but actually the Middle East is my area of specialty. I think the mood within Israel is still very much on October 7th, and that's actually becoming a problem. And I say that not because I don't empathise and don't understand just what kind of a national trauma this is, an open and a bleeding wound. There are still hostages on the ground. They're still learning stories from the people that were released. They lost 11 soldiers yesterday. The fighting's getting harder. The goals are getting harder to meet. The global support is eroding. And what the Israelis need to do is to start thinking about what's next. And I think while there are some practical-minded people who know that's the imperative, it's 60 days, 65 days. It's not 20 years ago. It's very hard to think about how I'm going to deal with these people who celebrated from the rooftop. The people who won't end up dead, who celebrated from the rooftops, who participated in stoning and throwing and harassing and attacking and celebrating what happened on October 7th. It's very hard for them, but this is what happens when you're a country. You're not an emotion, you're not a movement. It isn't the Zionist movement that it was before 1948. Israel is a modern, very successful, wealthy country, and it has to start thinking about what the next steps are. And that, I think, is going to be the big hump they need to get over in the coming weeks.
I mean, the two-state solution, that's the hope we've been clinging to despite everything for probably the last 20 years or more of diplomacy. I mean, you would still like it to be possible, but everything tells you it's pretty much impossible after this.
Well, it's become a hallmark card. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and two-state solution. This is a meaningless phrase. You don't build a state on a terrorist organization. You don't build a state and support it that's going to come and find you and do October 7th again and again and again. You don't. This is the onus. You can't. And here, the onus is not simply on the Palestinians, because many Palestinians are victims of Hamas. Many Palestinians are victims of the Palestinian Authority, of Fatah, the main party there. it is also the responsibility of all of those who love to, who love to preen about their virtue in supporting a two-state solution, to actually understand what a Palestinian state can look like that can live in peace and security with Israel. That's the problem. Nobody ever wants to get beyond the card. Nobody ever wants to get beyond the line and say, oh, what is Palestine? What are the institutions of Palestine? Who's going to be governing there? Is it going to be a terrorist state? Is it going to be the caliphate, the ISIS caliphate? Is it going to be another Iran? Because, nobody will give a damn, of course, if it is down the road, because that's the fate of the world. Look at Africa. Oh, liberated from the colonizers. Okay. Oh, wow. You're a dump. A human rights violating, poverty, grifting, corrupt state that oppresses your own people, but nobody cares anymore because it's not the Brits doing it anymore or the French doing it anymore. We need to be more adult than that and understand that this needs to be a state that serves the Palestinian people and responds to the security needs of the Israelis, not a state that just makes us feel good about the fact that we back the two-state solution.
Yeah, so it comes back, I suppose, to where we started about foreign policy built on cliches. We've got to get beyond that. We've got to start having adult conversations about the real world, a world that involves trade-offs.
Yes, well, you know that expression, from your mouth to God's ears. I've been working on this area for 40 years, and I haven't seen any maturation in that regard at all.
Danielle, it's been great to have you on Battleground, and maybe we'll talk to you again soon.
Well, I hope so. Thanks for having me. Great questions.